we're back, everybody. My goodness, what a pleasure. Madhava Setty, Dr. Madhava Setty, thank you for coming back on the show. I'm thrilled to have you back and continue our conversation and maybe add some additional things that have happened in the meantime since we talked last.
Well, Amy, thank you for inviting me back on. It's a pleasure to be here. I hope we've resonated with some of your listeners from our last talk.
We did. We actually had a lot of questions, particularly like on the YouTube channel. And for everybody, like I mentioned in the intro, that's episode 224, where we talked about critical thinking skills. We did a little bit of a dive into your book, Woke, which was incredible. We only got to the first half talking about intuition, conspiracy theory, and what is truth, the difference between knowledge and belief, and why we believe what we believe. How do we know what we believe is actually true? Where are we sourcing our information? It was a deep discussion, but the main takeaway a lot of people got from that, Madhava, was that they realized that we just got to question things and have the right to question things and not assume things, whether our own beliefs or what other people are saying. And just, why not just question it? What's wrong with that? And then kind of dig deeper and do our own research and just not automatically accept everything that we've been told. That was a big takeaway.
Well, I think you summarized it well. I believe that's exactly why scientific opinion is so credible. Is because you can challenge it. It's only dogma and religious doctrine that cannot be challenged. And we saw that happen in the Renaissance in Western Europe. And the reason why that's interesting at this moment is at that time, astrologically, if we wish to pursue that avenue of thought, is Pluto was in Aquarius in around the middle of the 16th century. And it happened again at the end of the 18th century with the American Revolution and the French Revolution. And we're in that place again right now. And what I think is interesting about the sequence of events is 480 years ago, when Pluto was in Aquarius, we questioned dogma. And we had this amazing thing called the Renaissance, which gave us a scientific method and gave us the wherewithal to challenge the edicts and fiats coming from the Pope, the authority on everything back then. Then, 240 years later, at the end of the 18th century, we challenged the idea of power and self-governance and science. And we formed the first democracies on the planet since ancient Greece. That period also saw the advent of the very first vaccine against smallpox. And here we are, 240 years later, Pluto enters Aquarius, and we are doing the same things exactly again. We are challenging authority. We're challenging the scientific paradigm and the orthodoxy. And guess what else is on the block? The idea that these vaccines are perhaps not as good as we thought they were. I think it's all very fascinating.
I love that you brought that up, because this has come up on my show before. I've had a couple astrologers on the show talking about how the last time the stars were in certain positions was 1776, the revolution, and it's happening again. And it's just really mind blowing for all of us to really let that sink in for a minute, that what's going on, folks, is much bigger than what's in front of us. You know what I mean? Think about that. This is the stars are literally aligned how they were at that time right now.
In many ways, yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And that really takes you out of the myopic everyday monotony of things and makes you really stop for a minute and think, I'm alive right now at this time. Wow, there's really something going on. So what would you say, what do we do with that? How do we use that knowledge, Madhava, to kind of help us navigate wisely at this time?
I think it's important always to take a deep breath before you address these kinds of questions, especially when it comes to interacting with another human being. The exchange of ideas can be done with the correct energetic vibration, because each of these moments in history have been a time where we are looking for clarity. And in order to see the world clearly, we need to first take a glance inward and look at the lenses through which we are apprehending what's in front of us. That's kind of what our conversation was last time about the biases and how do we know what we know. But as we approach this moment right now, you mentioned the American Revolution, we have something, again, that's peculiarly coincidental, which is the last time we had a candidate that won for the POTUS, for the President of the United States, that did not come from one of two major parties was George Washington. And what we're seeing now politically is very, very interesting. We have the emergence of a third candidate, depending on how deeply you've looked. I'm not going to say anything political, but that is actually also unfolding in front of us right now. The challenge to science, the challenge to vaccines, the challenge to the political systems that we have put in place that were supposed to deliver us from authoritarian rule. But I believe a lot of your audience, I would imagine, is able to sense that we don't really have a representative democracy. We have something much, much different, a plutocracy or some sort of corporate illusion of self-governance. So, all of these things are on the block right now. Let's take a look inward and recognize how important it is to convey information with some love and clarity and not demand that you are absolutely correct. Haven't you noticed this, Amy? This is what I find really interesting, is that if you jump onto Twitter or X, what it's called right now, it is a very, very violent way of communicating. People are hurt. They're looking for a quick takedown of people in order to generate more attention. And although it brings a place that's relatively uncensored, it also is generating a lot of noise. And what I find interesting there is the rudeness very often that's expressed between people. I would suggest that rudeness and being curt comes from a place of certainty, because only when you know that you are absolutely right and the other person is absolutely wrong would you venture to use denigrating language. Because imagine the pie in your face if you find out that you were wrong and you look back at all of the terrible things you said about someone because they disagreed with you. You don't do that if you're absolutely certain that you're right. I mean, you would do it if you're certain you're right. You would go ahead and say whatever words you want to say. So that's what happens when you're certain. Not only do you suffocate inquiry, but you start to say a lot of bad things and a lot of deeply dark, energetic expressions of your opinion. So it's a fascinating thing right now. And as you alluded to before, we're watching things start to crumble in front of us. Very, very trusted opinions and belief systems are wavering, in my opinion. And we also, I was going to talk about the eclipse that happened very recently and some things that have sort of unfolded immediately afterwards.
I definitely want to get your take on the eclipse, and just to kind of give my take on what's going on with online comments and forums and things. And we've probably all heard this before, but people behave and say things to each other online, unlike what they would do in person. I mean, people wouldn't talk to a stranger that way face to face. There's a permanency in the written word. So you can react emotionally and you bang out a response. It's like if you get a nasty email or a disparaging remark or whatever, and you respond emotionally, but then the next day or 2 days later, you think, oh crap, I overreacted. I didn't really mean it like that. And when you get older and wiser, we all know you don't do knee-jerk reactions. And that's happened to me many times. I won't shoot back a reply. I will sit on it no matter how pissed off I get or hurt I get. And sure enough, after that initial sting dissipates a little, my higher mind, my more loving, connected self, more secure self chimes in. And then I draft a reply that's much more centered, less defensive, less engaging, less combative, all that stuff. Because there's that pause. But what's happening with online is, people are feeling much more free to say things off the cuff with no accountability. And it's more of that immediate, and then it's on there. It's up there permanently. You can't take it down. You said it. It's there. Everyone saw it, So that's going on a little bit too. Yeah.
And yeah, you're right. Like, look at the difference between what we yell out in the car.
Right.
To someone that it's just that 2 planes of glass is enough for you to, use your potty mouth and flip somebody off. You would never do it in an elevator next to them.
Right.
And now we're even more removed online.
Yeah.
And as you said, I think it's very important to take some time before you respond to a disparaging comment.
It's that detachment of humanity.
Yes.
Even like, you watch a movie from the 1700s or whatever, or like the Vikings or whatever. I mean, they had hand-to-hand combat. They would charge at each other, like come in on a freaking wooden boat and like storm the freaking castle and like run up with like a spear and being shot at with arrows and like face to face. I mean, that doesn't happen nowadays. Nowadays, it's like drones dropping on people in the middle of the night, like unseen. You never see the person's human face. It's like that detachment. I don't know. It's like it lends us to an evil nature. Like we don't see the consequence directly of really what we're doing.
We don't.
Very dangerous.
It is extremely, extremely dangerous. And this is also what's happening with bioweapons. I believe that's
right.
Bioterrorism is the way to go for governments to overthrow another government and not destroy the infrastructure, right? You just make everybody sick. So all of these things are in consideration. But with regard to the disparaging remarks, I would just like to make this comment, because if we're forming a collective right now with your audience and other audiences that are trying to do the right thing and trying to bring clarity to the moment, it's important to notice how we get triggered. And I would suggest that knee-jerk response that you're talking about is in response to the idea that you were made to feel small because you were wrong, or there's some other comment like, you don't know what you're talking about, or who are you to say this? It feels good to retort immediately because there's some part of you that feels small, or that you were made smaller by this. And I suggest that if you're very confident in your position and yourself, and you're in complete harmony with your own nature and you've done the work, you're not going to be nearly as insulted. And that will bring you to a place of clarity and temperament much more quickly. So it's something to notice, because all of those things that you mentioned, all of those responses that we've been responsible for in the past, that's part of us. And there's no reason to excise it from who we are. We are the totality of all emotions and responses. And we have this ability to pick and choose which part of us we would like to bring forward. And it's better to do it from a place of self-confidence and self-love, I think.
Such an important point. You mentioned at the beginning about, the whole scientific realm kind of starting to be a little shaky narrative and people starting to raise an eyebrow a little bit. You obviously are a medical doctor, have been for a long time. Can you share with the audience, maybe for those of us who kind of always grew up as the doctor was the default, like that was the authority. You went by their advice. They're the expert. They know better. They are properly trained and went through med school and all that stuff. But you were on the inside. So what would you like people to know who say that? My doctor, the WHO and the CDC and all that, they have our best interest at heart. You're on the inside. What do you want people to know who kind of believe that still think that, I don't know, like it's all on the up and up and everyone's got good values like they do?
I always think it's best to start off with a question and not tell people the way things are. And the first question I would ask to someone like that, who is doubling down in terms of their trust in the CDC and our agents of public health, is I say, how do you confront the situation where an expert disagrees with the CDC or a bunch of experts? These are people that know more than you. These are people who have done tons of training and have come up with a different conclusion. What is it that makes you choose to disregard their opinion and go with the CDC? You're talking about two groups that are experts, that know more than you. So how do you make up your mind?
They're probably not even aware there's another group doing that, though, because they don't hear about that. They don't hear about those experts that are going against the CDC and the party narrative.
Mm-hmm.
They might not even be aware there are a group of experts like that.
So if they're not, and they respond to you, well, there are no experts, there's plenty of places you can go and say, well, listen to what this person is saying. Okay. Here's somebody who is a world-renowned epidemiologist who has published 400 papers. Those papers have been cited 50,000 times by medical literature, and he's come to a different conclusion. And he's gone through all of the same or better academic training that Anthony Fauci has. How do you decide now? I mean, listen to what they have to say first, and then tell me why you think he's wrong. And someone who is a layperson has to, if they're thinking clearly, has to admit, I don't know. I actually don't know. And I still want to go with the CDC. That's totally fine. But as long as you acknowledge that you may not be sure, that opens up a place to do some self-inquiry. So something is driving you to believing the CDC. And I understand why, because we, as you said, we grew up in an environment where we were supposed to trust the establishment. We're supposed to trust our authorities. And nobody's perfect, right? So the question is, how would you know if you're wrong? How would you know if they're wrong? You won't know. But there are some clues. If you don't know, you have two very intelligent groups that are debating with each other about things that you can't actually understand. You actually cannot make a judgment as to whose argument is better or more sound. So if you can step back from this and step back from all of the things that you invested in your belief around, say, the CDC, and notice that you have two groups of people that are saying opposite things, and both sides are telling you not to listen to the other side. Both sides are telling you that the other side is giving you misinformation and it's dangerous. They both are saying exactly the same thing. So not being able to make a judgment on the information that's being conveyed, you are left with this one difference, which is one side is asking for debate and the other side is saying, no, we're not going to talk to you because we're so right. What are you going to do? Does this make any difference in the way you consider the situation you're in? I would say that there's no wrong answer. You're going to pick whatever you pick. But you must notice that if you're going to go with the group that does not want to debate, how then will they ever know if they're wrong if they don't want to listen to a contrary opinion? You're stuck. This, what we're describing right here, is called, in philosophical terms, this is called dogma. You can't get out of it because one of the tenets of your systems of belief is that if anybody disagrees with you, they must be wrong. So you're stuck. You can choose to be in that position if you want to, but it's your choice. How do you approach the situation? And nobody has to take my word for it. I'm just telling you my candid description of what's happening on the inside of hospitals and conversations in medical lounges that I'm privy to. And they're probably similar to the ones I'm having. When I approach a physician about this, we're talking about the vaccine, the pandemic response. It's always best, as I said before, to ask a question and not make a statement. And where I'd like to start, usually with physicians especially, is, look, we all remember the reason why most people got the vaccine. Some people were forced to because they had to work, but many people got it voluntarily because they were told that it was 95% effective. And I then say, so please define what 95% effective means. Can you define that? And honestly, I would say less than half of physicians can tell me what the formula is for vaccine efficacy. 1 minus the incidence of an event of the treatment group divided by the incidence of the event in the placebo group. That's what efficacy is. But that doesn't mean anything to anybody, right? So how did you interpret 95% efficacious? The next question is, how do you think the public interpreted that number?
Right.
I would imagine I could be wrong, but I would imagine that people who heard 95% effective means, oh my gosh, if I get the vaccine, there's a 95% chance that I won't get COVID.
I'm not going to get it. Exactly.
And it's like, of course you get it, but what does it, that's not actually what it meant at all, you know?
Nope. And but they knew that. I mean, that was kind of intentional, you know, because this is happening across the board, whether we're buying eggs or free range meat or whatever, like they're intentionally using certain phrases because they think we're going to believe it means one thing when it really doesn't.
Yeah, they're being disingenuous with us, but the point is physicians should have been able to decipher the fact, or at least notice the fact that people were being misled.
Yeah.
And when a physician or a medical professional cannot answer the question, what does 95% effective means? That means that they too were misled. They just believed. And most health professionals just believe, just like most lay people believe. And it's a major problem. So that's where I start. And more often than not, everybody listens up. They want to hear it. Or there is a subset of professionals that just turn away and say, oh, this is more anti-vax bullshit. People are coming around. There's no question about it. And I really like being in that environment. I like working with people on the trailing edge, the ones that have not looked at the data, have not looked at the published preprint studies that demonstrate a significant harm. They haven't done any of those things. They haven't gone and read the studies, but they are waking up to the fact that there is another story that is happening right now. And maybe it's time to get acquainted with it. And so that's the point, is to generate a situation where they become curious about what they don't know. And it's very, very easy to shut down curiosity. You can tell them that, you know, I'm not vaxxed. I would never make that kind of mistake. And right there, boop, that's it. End of story. You know, who wants to listen to that, right?
That's right.
So that's why I'm saying we have to be very, very careful with how we share information.
Yes. Yeah.
And we're not doing a good job, honestly. Those of us on the inside, we're just making claims that we can't back up. We go a little bit too far to sound more convincing. And then eventually we get called out, as we should. So
it's true.
It's you know,
both sides are guilty of that for sure. I would agree. And I've probably been guilty of that myself because there's such strong emotion behind it. And again, we go back to this belief idea. And I think at the end of the day, most people just want everybody else to be okay. You know, whatever side you're on, you think that this is the way to make everybody be okay, you know, but I will say that I also know there's a big part of people that just, they give you the hand. They don't want to hear it because, and probably some of your colleagues, because it's so monumentous and all the ramifications of what that means is such a huge thing. It creates so much anxiety and discomfort. They literally can't handle it. What do you think about that? Like, what do we do with that? Like, how do we, we can't change people's minds or any of that. And that's not our job. We don't want to do that, but gee whiz. I mean,
well, it's much harder to get to the truth from beginner's mind than to unlearn what you've learned. If you've started off with a initial impression of something, it's very, very difficult to let it go, especially if you can't get unvaccinated, right? So why on earth would you want to hear of all the potential dangers or risks that now apply to you?
Right. That's true.
So that is something to keep in mind as you're talking to somebody who can't undo what they did.
That's a very good point.
Undo what they did to their child.
Yes.
So I would say it is extremely reasonable for them to say, I don't want to hear about it. What we can talk about is, can we at least agree that this should have never been mandated, that you should not have had to take it to keep your job? Do you agree with that?
And not let it happen again, or think twice, or dig deeper next time, or whatever, or what to do to help fix yourself.
That's right. Yes, that's the word.
Yeah,
it's not
empathy.
A fits all. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so another important part of your book that I wanted to get into with you was you challenge the concept of money, and kind of you talk about how the way we think of it's the way that we conceive of money in the monetary system and the banking system is actually not based in reality. This is huge for me because this is another huge wake up call I had this year, was understanding. And I think a lot of people, maybe in my audience, we just think of American currency and dollars as money and valuable and the way it is. We don't even know something of the term, the fiat system, fiat currency, what that is, how it hasn't always been this way, how there was a gold standard and Nixon took us off it in 71, and what the ramifications of that are, and inflation and what that really means, and the Federal Reserve and the fact that it's not federal and it's not a reserve and it's actually a private cartel. And like, we don't even understand all of this basic stuff about our global economy and our monetary system, which is nuts. Like the fact that that's not even taught in school. But again, part of the big wake up that we are in right now. I mean, like we mentioned before we were recording, that there's all these industries are now getting like uncloaked as far as what's really going on under the covers. And the money system is just another one. So please, could you give us the 101 for those of us who are really newbies, and this is all new? What do we need to know, Madhava, about the money system, about the banking system, and all that stuff?
Sure. Well, I'll start off by saying that there are many people out there that know more about this than I do. What I like to do, though, or what I think I'm good at, is at least explaining the basics so that you can go to your own conclusions.
Okay.
And I usually like to start with the question. I always start with a question, right? Which is, let's say you go to the bank and you get a mortgage and you sign a promissory note for $1 million. The first question I would ask is, where does that money come from? And most people have not thought about it. They think of the bank as it has a large room that is very protected with all kinds of locks on it. And that's where they keep the money.
A big vault.
A big vault.
Yeah.
So that's not where they get it. And the response usually is, well, what do you mean then? Like, how does it work? And why should I believe you? And my response to that is, if you think the money comes from the people who have deposited money with them, when they check their balance at any moment in time, it's not going to be diminished by the $1 million that you took out. So clearly, this $1 million that you now have in your account comes from someplace else. And the shocking reality to this is that that money gets created the moment you sign the promissory note. With that signature and your promise to pay them back, they have a central computer, let's say, that enters $1 million under your name, Amy Fournier. And now you have $1 million to spend. So what's the big deal? Well, the big deal, first of all, is as soon as you get that money and now you can spend that $1 million on a house, there's now $1 million more in circulation. And because that $1 million didn't exist before, suddenly you can buy a house and you couldn't before. And the money came from nowhere. So that means that the value of every single dollar in everyone's wallet has been diminished a little bit. However, if people are borrowing tons of money, we are throwing money into circulation. And if you were to do this on your own, that's called counterfeiting. You just make fake money, you create money out of nowhere, and you put it into the system. However, if you go through our system of banking, not a problem. So now the question becomes, first, our understanding of inflation, which means prices are getting higher. That's how we talk about it. Oh, the prices are higher. Prices are higher, but they're not moving on their own. They're actually the end product of currency that is more devalued now. So that's what we do every time our government goes into deficit spending, and the money that they cannot raise from signing their own promissory notes, which would be in the form of T-bills and T-notes and these loans that we take from the people, the money that is not covered is being pulled out of nowhere and is now entering the circulation. So every time we have a calamity or things that cost a lot of money, especially, that's going to significantly increase the level of monetary devaluation. This is the interesting point here, is this is actually lawful in the way we've written our laws. And what I'm referring to here is a bank's ability to lend money that they don't have. This is called fractional reserve lending, in that they only need to have a fraction in reserves of what they lend to you. And those rules are dictated by what an institution we call the Federal Reserve System. If you're a bank that operates under their protection, they follow their rules for how much that they can lend out based upon what they have. Now, what's really scary is when you sign a promissory note to that bank, that note or your promise to pay them $1 million is considered an asset of the bank. That means under the regulations that we operate under, that bank can now, if they only need to keep 10% in reserves, they can now make another loan of $900,000 because they're going to collect $1 million from you. So you see, this is a very, very destructive system if everybody is taking out loans. Because the more loans that are signed for, the more money comes into circulation and the more inflation we have. So the problem we now have is that central banks, and the central bank in this country is called the Federal Reserve, and central banks have the unique authority to bring money into circulation based on rules that were spelled out in the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. Central banks around the world, if you type in central bank inflation rate, they have agreed amongst themselves that a healthy rate of inflation is 2%. And we have to ask ourselves, what does that mean? Why do we need to have an inflation rate that is 2%? In other words, next year, your dollar is going to be worth 98 cents. What does that do? Well, immediately you see that creates an incentive to take a loan because you want to take the loan now so you can have it now and not wait 5 years until you can save the money when it's going to be more expensive. So get the loan now and pay the bank the interest and you get to enjoy it now. That's what we do. Notice that when you take a loan, what happens? Money gets devalued. So we have this cycle that keeps us pushing more and more towards having to deal with the devaluation of our currency because more money is coming into circulation. And I suggest that over the long run, this is going to deplete your prosperity. What do you think has happened over the last 50 years? When I was a kid, most of my friends had one parent that were working, and they all owned a small house that was modest. Everybody had a car or 2 cars, and they could take vacations. That doesn't happen anymore, or very, very rarely. You cannot afford to have a family of 4 unless you have a very high earner, and forget about a house. So somehow things have become less affordable. Is it because things are getting expensive? Yes. Is it also because your money now is not worth as much as it used to? Yes. So what is causing the continued depletion of our prosperity, or in other words, our wealth? It has to do with the fact that we are continually increasing money that's being put into circulation. The reason why these central banks do not want there to be zero inflation, that would be ideal, right? The problem with zero inflation is now that there's no incentive to take loans. There's less incentive to take loans because it's not going to be more expensive. But what's going to happen? Well, first of all, if there's less incentive to take loans and less loans are being taken, then that cuts into banking profits because they're making a ton of money without doing very much, right? All they have to do is type in $1 million and all that money gets eventually paid back to you, and it actually leaves circulation when that note gets paid off, but they collect the interest on the side, right? So they want to loan money as much as they can. It's like, oh boy, the bank approved my loan, thank you, bank. And I'm so proud of myself. It's like they actually are dying to lend money out. And to give you credit cards, at an exorbitant rate of interest.
Yep.
But here we have now a situation where you don't have necessarily as much incentive to take out a loan. So that is going to take a cut into the bank's profits because less people want to take loans. As the population grows, if no money is being created by loan taking, that means the number of dollars is going to be spread across a greater number of people. What does that mean? Well, that means that your money today is probably going to be worth a little bit more next year because there's more people now. And what the central banks have been telling us is, well, if that's the case, then productivity is going to go down. People don't want to take loans. There's going to be less investments. There'll be less jobs. And all of those things are true. But it's predicated on this hypothesis that the world will shut down if we don't have a little bit of inflation, which is absolutely wrong because we all have needs. We all have desires. We all, want to take a vacation. We all need fuel. We all need cell phones. We all have to produce things, but we don't have to fight this 2% uphill climb to it. And that is, I would say, in a nutshell, like how it's working. This is possibly the greatest conspiracy that has been perpetrated on the people of this world is the idea of central banking, because there's no way you can get a country to fight a prolonged conflict if every month the government comes to you and says, well, you're going to throw in an extra $200 to fight this war in Afghanistan. Suddenly, there's going to be a lot less appetite for war. But if you can ask the Federal Reserve to loan the government the money to pay for soldiers and armaments, then people are less likely to resist, especially if they're very passionate about, whatever their ideology is about what America's role is in war. But the point here is that the central bank now, we can see, has an incentive for disasters to occur. And this is, I think, where the jump comes from being someone who really understands the system correctly and becoming a conspiracy theorist. Because the folks who control our money supply are the ones that benefit most from disasters, from wars, from pestilence, from pandemics, because we need to borrow money to fight these things off. And one must ask the question, with that much money involved, do you think there is some kind of conspiracy or some desire even of those people in those cartels for disasters to occur? Could they be pushing things along in any way? Could they be in control of governments that are incentivized to fight and create, spending programs to deal with disasters? So look, I'm putting it out there as a question. This is a question we all have to ask ourselves. And I would suggest that look hard into this. Like, why must there be a 2% inflation rate?
I just love how you pose it as a question. It's very non-confrontational and enables the person you're having a conversation with to go there without feeling judged or, dangerous or anything. It just opens it up and is producing a conversation. And I just want to add my very small 2 cents in this topic, because this is really out of my skill set, but I'm learning about, money and banking myself, that what I'd like people to understand is that I didn't know that the Federal Reserve wasn't a federal agency. That name, once again, is misleading. It's not federal. It's not a reserve. It was started, and correct me if I'm wrong, back in 1910 by 6 of the world's richest men who secretively got on a train incognito, didn't even use their full names, and went down to an island in Georgia, secretly met because they were the top bankers of the country at the time, and decided, you know what? Rather than compete with each other and fighting each other for resources and power and money, why don't we join forces and kind of control the market? So basically, they created a monopoly. They took out a free market. In 1913, they got the law passed through Congress somehow, the Federal Reserve Act.
Yep.
And they basically positioned themselves to control the money supply and literally print money whenever they wanted to it, because it had no inherent value. It just was a piece of paper that's a symbol of value that was agreed upon in the culture. And that started the whole thing. And it's like people don't even realize, like, this is what we're talking about, everybody, that this Federal Reserve is a group of like people that are privately owned, very, very wealthy, and in control of the monetary system of the country, and therefore probably in control of our government to some extent. That's who's controlling all this stuff. And that's what I feel I didn't know. I think a lot of people don't know, and it's probably on purpose. That's kind of my 2 cents in the conversation. For people to look into that. Look into that. In the book, I mean, you must know J. Edward Griffin's book.
That's the book to read, people. You should read it. This is it, right here. You should read it cover to cover. Cover to cover. Yes, The Creature from Jekyll Island by J. Edward Griffin. It's a wonderful book. He's a really good writer, too. He's not just a good researcher.
Yes.
He's talking about this for 50 years. And to add to that, as you said, they now have this ability to basically print, very little limited money. However, what's that going to lead to? That's going to lead to hyperinflation, right? So guess what happened that very same year? And that's when we introduced the federal income tax. Why, right? If you can print money, why do you need to tax people? Because they're going to pay for it with the devaluation of their currency, right? You just you have to pay for something, you just print the money. Well, the value of the dollar is going to sink. So there has to be some way of recollecting those dollars. You have to get them out of circulation. So we have to, a system has to be designed. And again, I'm just talking about this at the surface. I'm sure you have listeners out there. They're like, oh, well, Setty didn't really go far enough, but you have to pull the money out of circulation, which means you have to get it from the people. Isn't that the reason why we have an income tax? Like when the income tax was first introduced, it was brought to the people as, look, what we're having right now is things are so expensive right now because we have to put tariffs on imported goods. And we need imported goods and tariffs because it makes the cost of things go up. It hurts the poor people disproportionately. The rich people don't really care about the tariffs because they can afford everything. So why don't we do something good for the people? And we will tax only the top 3% of the population. 97% of the people, don't worry about it. You can keep all of your income. Only the top 3% had to pay something like 1% income tax on income over $3,000 per annum. So this was introduced to the public as, look, it's going to help you. Everybody, it's going to be offset by the rich people who are paying income taxes. And it was signed into law. I believe 60% of people in this country pay income taxes, and the highest tax bracket is 37%. And of course, there are all of these loopholes that allow the super rich to hide their money and do all these things. But my point here is that, isn't it interesting that the income tax was introduced at the same time as the Federal Reserve? And I'm suggesting that's exactly why it was done that way. And
not a coincidence.
Right. Not a coincidence. It had to be done that way. We have to pull money out. So we have to be able to tax people. And this was a way. When the Federal Reserve was installed, it didn't immediately start printing tons of money. Similarly, when the income tax law was brought into effect, we didn't start heavily taxing everybody. These were put into place to execute a system of control that took 120 years to get to where it is today, right now. So ask yourself how many legislators know about this. Do they know what fractal reserve lending is? Do they understand what is fiat currency, which is fiat meaning you must use this?
It's force. It means force, right?
Yes.
The root of the word.
You have to pay, if you pay things in legal tender. So that's why it's called fiat. We're being forced to do it, and we've just grown accustomed to doing it. So just like ask your doctor, please, what's the definition of vaccine efficacy? They're not going to be, they might be able to, but I'm just saying that the people who make the laws don't know the basics. That's where we're at right now.
Very dangerous to have that kind of power when you don't know the basics. So
they shouldn't have the power. I agree.
Okay. As we get to the end, I've got 2 more questions for you. This has been very helpful. Tell us your take on the recent eclipse that you mentioned at the beginning.
I went to see it myself up in Burlington, Vermont.
Excellent.
And it's something that I've wanted to do for a very long time. The eclipse event is very unique on the Earth. We have one source of light, right? And 8 planets and 200 and some moons. So things are always eclipsing the sunlight. But what's interesting about a total solar eclipse on this planet is that the size of the moon in the sky is almost exactly the size of the sun's. Not all the time. Sometimes it's a little bit smaller. It depends on how far the moon is away during the eclipse event. But when it matches up, like it did last month, almost exactly a month ago, something really remarkable happens. First, you go into nighttime, basically. And you also get to see what's called the corona of the sun. The corona of the sun is the sun's atmosphere, which is much, much hotter, but not nearly as bright as the sun's surface. So we never get to see it except during these moments of totality. Now, this is very interesting to me because astrologers put some significance on eclipse events. Like it is the death of some way of thinking about something and the rebirth or the reworking of something that emerges from the return of the sunlight. When I was in my 20s, I spent 5 or 6 weeks in the Arctic in the summertime, and we had continuous daylight for almost 6 weeks. And that was jarring to not see the night sky for that length of time. And there is something very important that happens when you interrupt this cycle of nighttime, daytime. And I think that may have some significance when we try to understand how the eclipses affect us collectively. And this event was the most remarkable thing I've ever seen in my life.
Really?
And the reason for that is it was incredibly beautiful. And we were very, very lucky to have a clear day in New England in April at the very time that totality came nearby. So this was made incredibly convenient. Getting there and viewing it was just the most incredible thing I've ever seen because it is remarkably beautiful. And if you've ever been in a partial eclipse, it's not so magical. Like you can see the fact that shadows look a little bit different. It's getting a little bit darker and cooler, and then everything is over. In totality, you're going from bright afternoon sunshine, and over the course of about 45 minutes to an hour, it starts to get a little darker. But when totality hits, when that last glimmer of sunshine is occluded, you go into nighttime. You see stars and planets. And when you look up at the moon, what you see instead is a dark orb that has a halo of this beautiful, like, glow around it. And it's almost like a psychedelic experience.
Because I went outside, I stayed in Massachusetts during it, and I went outside with my dogs, and
you have to have totality.
It kind of looked like a cloudy day. It kind of looked like what you just described.
Yes, you have to get the totality. You can't, 99% is not, it's completely different than 100%. So the locus or the space where totality occurs is very small compared to, you have to be exactly in the path. And this is a rare event, not only because the sun and moon are the exact same diameter in the sky during this particular event, but also that the orbit of the moon around the Earth is in a different plane than the plane that the Earth is in with regards to the sun. So the moon is always casting a shadow someplace, but it doesn't always fall on the Earth. What's interesting about this in terms of the solar system and other planets is that there was a researcher, programmer, and eclipse chaser that was able to calculate from the data that we have available that there's 2 other places where totality can occur, where the size of the satellite or the moon exactly fits the apparent size of the sun in the sky on that planet. One is around Saturn and one is around Jupiter. The reason why I want to say this is that those eclipse events are incredibly brief because the moon is very small and so is the sun. So it happens like this. And it's on a gaseous planet, right? So you're never going to see that. The Earth is the planet closest to the sun that has a moon. And we have one of the biggest moons in the solar system. I believe it's the 5th biggest moon, and it happens to match the sun. So we have an event that lasts 3.5 minutes or sometimes longer. And you can stand on solid ground and watch this thing unfold. Not only was it the beauty of what was observed in the sky, it was as the moon encroached the sun, It was how perfectly those two discs of shadow and light fit together exactly. When you see something like that, that is so exact, it makes you wonder, is this really a coincidence? Really? Like when you see that kind of miracle unfold in front of you with the perfect alignment, it's something to consider. I'm not saying that it's not a coincidence.
It's like holy. It's like it's unworldly. It's like divine and almost like the way the pyramids are put together. It's like, how could that even happen? Like a human can't do that. Did you feel anything?
I felt a lot. I felt awe.
Did anything happen inside you that was, I don't know, was something to notice?
Well, I think it's very subtle. Yeah. And I do believe there's something to it because the last time I was anywhere near a solar eclipse was the one that went through North America in August of 2017. My life took a new direction because that's when my wife showed me the video of Building 7 blowing up just a couple of weeks after that. And my entire life's trajectory has changed since that time. So how things are going to change right now, I don't know.
Yeah.
But what I'm interested in right now is to observe what's happening out there in the collective. Mm-hmm. And what I thought was interesting is that the very next day, on April 9th, a letter was written by a journalist at NPR. His name was Yuri Berliner, and he's a veteran editor and journalist at NPR in the DC offices. And he came forward and said, look, we've lost America's trust. This is what we're doing wrong. And it was a rare, candid moment for this particular news platform to come forward, or at least for someone there to say, yeah, we blew it, guys. We blew it on these 3 stories. And of course, the NPR official statement came out the next day that gave some anemic response and didn't address any of the concerns that this man had. So without going into details about it, the point here is that is there possibly a shift in the way our media is reporting on reality? And just this past weekend, there was another very interesting piece that came out on the New York Times where the reporter who's been reporting on the pandemic for 4 years wrote an article that was titled, "Thousands Believe They've Been Injured by COVID Vaccines. Is anyone listening?" Ooh. And I wrote a Substack piece on this, which I invite you all to read, but I read into that article and it's opened the door in the collective to a group of people that reads the New York Times religiously and are big vaccine, science proponents, are now confronted with the fact that their trusted news source is acknowledging the fact that some people may have been hurt. Thousands. And
it's big.
Yes, it's big, it's small. I don't know what to make of it, but things are definitely shifting.
At least we're having a conversation. At least we're having a conversation. Let's have a civil conversation. And let's all hope that at the end of the day, we all want the same thing for all of us to live in peace and harmony and be all we can be. And I feel most people feel that way. I don't know about some of the powers that be, but, collectively, we can be very, very powerful if we kind of stay focused on those things that unite us, that we ultimately want the same things. Let's get there together. Let's, nobody knows all the truth. We're not God, but let's try to figure it out, and listen to each other with respect.
Yeah, that's well said. I agree with you. I think it's important to, like you said, we don't know, we're not God. Yeah. I think it's important to embrace the fact that we don't know.
Yeah.
I think that's what drives us to know more. That's how we learn our lessons, is the desire to know more. And ultimately, if you believe in sort of my philosophy, which is at the end, if there is some sort of review of your life, let's say, that will shift what happens next, I would suggest that the true test was what was important to you when you didn't know? Like, how did you respond knowing that you didn't know? And this, I believe, actually is what robs us when we believe in dogmatic philosophical doctrines, is you are so certain. And very often you do it because you know for sure that if you do these things, you will be rewarded in heaven, let's say, or right. That's wonderful. You do good things. Nobody wants to create suffering, but it's a different sort of energetic signature one has when one commits to being good and being helpful and sacrificing oneself for others, not knowing what it means or what is the outcome, right? Because if you believe for sure that there's going to be some payback, that reduces, in my mind, the karmic contribution you have made.
Well, it's ultimately selfish. It's a barter. It's like, okay, I'm going to give you this to get that back. It's not truly giving.
So that's something to embrace here as we search for certainty. Notice that having certainty actually is not possible when it comes to what's really going on. We can be certain about what's not true, but being certain about what is impossible. And that is, in fact, the magic of this experience that we're having. Our soul's experience is not being able to know, but choosing a path. What is it based in if you don't know?
And trying to stay open, being careful we don't get caught in the echo chambers and the cognitive bias and, all that stuff, preaching to the choir, and try to stay open, regardless of what you think. I remind myself of that all the time. Stay kind, stay open. Everybody's doing the best they can. People are scared. People are confused. People are overwhelmed. It's like, be kind. Okay. Just try to help.
Or not be kind, right? I mean, I personally believe in being kind because I believe suffering is absolutely real. And this really comes down to how you view yourself and the world. Do you view yourself as separate from the world where the only person that matters? Or do you feel that you and me are the same, or at least are interconnected, and what hurts me is going to hurt you, and what hurts you is going to hurt me? And we don't know. Let's be very real. Like the people who say, well, of course you've got to be good to other people. You don't know that. You really don't know. But how do you choose? That's the key part.
Yeah. Beautiful. My final question for you, though, is that beautiful picture behind you. For those watching on YouTube, Awakening Aphrodite podcast, Fit Amy TV, he's got an absolutely beautiful octopus. Is it a painting? Is it a drawing? Tell us about that and why that is on your wall.
Would you believe that this is a charcoal drawing?
Okay.
Just charcoal. And my wife saw it and said, well, we got to have this. And it was by a artist whose name I don't know, and I'm sorry. I know my wife knows the name of the artist, but he was local and
it's gorgeous.
It might be one of the biggest pieces he's ever sold. And it was just too beautiful to not have with us. And
powerful.
We called it Kali.
Yeah.
And as you know, probably octopus are very, very intelligent. And
I did not know. Tell us about octopus. Tell us about why you chose that.
Well,
Octopi?
Probably octopi. They have this incredible ability of camouflage. I mean, just think about that. Like an octopus, which is like green and brown, goes into white sand and it turns white. They just blend right in. How does that happen? Think about the intelligence involved.
Right.
And they're very smart in terms of figuring their ways out of mazes.
They have to be smart. They're still alive, right? I mean, they've lived for millions of years. They're still here.
They're still around. Yes.
Yeah.
They are still around. And there was a great movie about this.
I was just noticing that. I'm like, I know there's a good reason. It's got a very strong energy. And plus they have a lot of tentacles and they got those little suction cups. So there's a lot of symbolism there, the spirit animal. And I didn't know about them changing colors. So they're able to adapt. Very, very cool. Awesome.
Yeah.
All right. Any final words to make you feel complete in what you want to leave us with today? You've shared so much wonderful stuff for us to think about.
As always, I'm grateful to have a conversation with you, Amy. Thank you for doing what you're doing to bring interesting conversations to your audience. I think this is a wonderful, wonderful time that we're in right now. Stay grounded and really pay attention to how you communicate. Because if we're going to get through this as elegantly as possible, we have to come together. And there's no use in burning bridges.
Agreed. How can people find you? Like, tell us about where to get this wonderful book, Woke and Anesthesiologist's View. We talked about it your last show, 224, Awakening Aphrodite. People can hear more about that. How can we find you?
Well, you can find the book on Amazon, or you can come to my website, madhavasettymd.com, where you can order directly from my publisher. But as I said before, that would mean that Jeff Bezos won't get a cut. Yeah. Anyway, I didn't write it to make money. I'm just hoping that it changes one person's perspective on things.
Changed mine.
It's wonderful to hear. Oh, it's a success then.
Yes, and I know a lot of other people too. And your Substack?
Yes, please go check out my Substack. It's called An Insult to Intuition. And you don't have to pay for it. You can be a free subscriber. I'm very interested in growing a community, an audience of readers that can come together and leave comments. You don't have to pay for a subscription to leave a comment and engage with my other readers who are very, very thoughtful. And it's called An Insult to Intuition because I believe we can figure things out intuitively. We have to. Otherwise, we're going to be stuck in the same way of approaching things, which is we have to trust somebody. Mm-hmm. Eventually, you're going to have to trust your intuition, because just as we said before, if you have two groups that are arguing and they're both experts, how do you decide which one to believe? Mm-hmm. At some point, your intuition has to be involved. So, yes, I hope your readership will take a look at some of those articles. I try to put one out every week, and there's always something interesting to write about, whether it's Nobel laureates in physics, what the New York Times just said, what doctors are saying, the eclipse. So, yes, come check it out. And thank you for allowing me to plug it.
Of course. Always something new and exciting. Thank you so much for coming back on the show. Everybody, please do check that out. And we'll see you next time on Awakening Aphrodite.
Bye, everybody.